welcome to our session. This is a GReVD session for the Stockholm Forum on Peace and Development. And what we wanted to do here was focus on the recent launch of the GVD, that's the Global Violent Deaths Database that Small Arms Survey puts together, and allow an opportunity to be able to introduce that, and then have a more broad discussion after we've discussed that and we've learned about the new data and we kind of are familiar with that. Then have a more broad discussion after that with the rest of the group about how do we estimate violent deaths. We've come to a consensus approach to it within the GReVD Consortium, and we'd like to present that to you. So Caroline Delgado from our team at SIPRI will do a short presentation of the visualization using the GVD data and some estimates that we have from WHO to kind of get at how we're estimating a lower bound and an upper bound for violent deaths. So I'm very excited to have a number of people here today. We have a nice sized group and it looks like a good discussion. It's growing as we're speaking. In a moment, I'm going to hand over the microphone to Anna Alvazzi. She's the senior advisor at Small Arms Survey. And she and Gergely Hideg, who is a survey specialist for the Small Arms Survey, are going to present the most recent data launch for the GVD. So it's a special opportunity to be able to learn from them the current data, but also to have some question and answer with them. And we'll do that for about the first 45 minutes or so of the session. Then in the course of that, we're going to introduce this concept that the GReVD Consortium has come up with, which is a lower bound and an upper bound estimate, because we don't really know how many violent deaths there are for a variety of reasons. And we have a very conservative number that is based on the Small Arms Survey GVD numbers. And that's our go-to. That's really our best estimate. And the GReVD Consortium has endorsed that as our best estimate, best guess of how many violent deaths there are. But it's a conservative number for a variety of reasons that we can get into in the question and answer. Then we have an upper bound, and the way we got to an upper bound is by taking everything that couldn't possibly be a violent death and taking that out of estimates of all deaths every year. And Caroline will introduce that concept a little bit more and explain where we get that data from, and then we'll have a little discussion around that. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Anna and Gergely, and they're going to go through and do a presentation on the GVD data. And then we'll have a question and answer and discussion just about GVD immediately after their presentation. So please go ahead, Anna.
Thank you very much. So good afternoon, good morning, depending where you are. And I see many familiar faces. Hello, everybody. I am at the moment sitting in Vienna. So for me, it's a nice afternoon time, quite convenient. I'm going to try to share the screen, so let's hope that it works. Can you see it?
Yes, we can see it.
Perfect, excellent. So let's hope that it also moves across the slides, because this is not immediate. So of course, there is a bit of lag. A bit of problems is always to be expected. I don't know, maybe Gergely, you still have the control, is it possible?
I don't.
You don't. Hmm? So I have to deal with this myself. Hmm? I don't know. Okay, I'll stop sharing.
Yeah.
I will try once again. Let's see if it works. Hmm. Sorry. Let's try if this, yes, okay.
There we go.
So, yes, so I'll explain a bit what we are going to talk about. We presented this database that is updated every year, and it's also updated retrospectively. So, meaning that we are looking for new data, but also for new data that become available for previous years. And the latest version that we launched in April contains data from 2004 to 2018. Data in this database refer to a broad concept of lethal violence. So it includes all forms of violent deaths, that is homicides, conflict-related deaths, legal interventions. And the suicides are excluded from this database. It builds on multiple sources. It's mostly official data from national and international sources, but it's also other data and estimates that are produced by international organizations and by academic think tanks, etc. The analysis that we are going to present here today refers to the main headlines that you can find also through the interactive map that is accessible from the SMORAM survey website. We are going to present a bit our scenarios. So on the basis of the data that we have and in support of the Sustainable Development Goals, we try to develop an analysis for the future to see that in support of target 16.1 of the Sustainable Development Goals that aims at a significant reduction of all forms of violence and related death rates, if we can expect something good happening based on some data that we have analyzed. And finally, we are going to see a bit the availability and quality of the data to connect with what Gary was explaining. So what is the possibility to find synergies from the pure database approach that we are taking now, mixing with the GReVD approach that is a registry approach, how the two can complement each other and how much we can advance in knowledge. So the headings, so these are the numbers that we have published for 2018, a total of approximately 596,000 deaths, violent deaths. So this is a number that includes, as I said, both conflict and non-conflict settings. And here in gray, I hope that you can see it, there is also the trend of the rate per 100,000 population starting from 2004 to 2018. Of course, since we have adjusted retrospectively, it's better not to go back to our previous publications, but to use this new data to compare trends. But anyway, the trends keep corresponding to what we found previously. We observed an increase between 2016 and 17, and now the trend has changed. So the rate of 7.80 observed in 2018 is actually the lowest since 2012. So the reduction that we have seen anticipates something that will be analyzed further in a publication that we are preparing, which will be ready in July, around the time of the high-level political forum, the HLPF. The biggest share of the reduction is caused by a reduction in conflict-related deaths. And homicides, actually, the numbers were a bit higher, but the population surpassed, the growth of the population surpassed the increase in numbers. So there was a marginal decrease also in non-conflict deaths. So the firearm killings is one of the key indicators that we are using to measure the impact of illicit arms flows. In support of another target, target 16.4 of the Sustainable Development Goals that, among other things, aim at a significant reduction of illicit arms flows. What do we observe? That 38% in total of killings were committed with firearms. So this is more or less a stable rate that we have observed over years. We know that this percentage is slightly higher in non-conflict settings with respect to conflict settings. And we know that this is a number that is highly gendered. And actually here on the right of this chart, you can observe that 92% of the victims of firearm killings were male and only 8% were female. And that is more than what you see in the general distribution in the database, where you have 84% of male victims and 16% of female victims. That is a proportion that, again, remains relatively stable over time. But as you can see here in the two lines that you have on the right of the chart, the 2.48 rate that is observed in 2018 is the second lowest registered since 2004. So again, the numbers with the population growth change a bit. And if you go to the black line and you observe the rate of females killed by firearms, that appears to be very stable, 0.6, 0.59. Also, that instead hides a number that is quite high. So in reality, the number of females killed by firearms in 2018 was the highest in the entire period. So with these headlines give you a hint, a flavor of the type of numbers that we're dealing with. And now I give the floor to Gergely, who will navigate a bit in the scenarios and in the assessment of the availability and quality of the data.
Thank you. Thank you, Anna. You were great keeping your time. I hope I will be as disciplined as you, at least. Did you grant me access so I can move?
I did.
But it didn't arrive yet. Can you just move it if you can still?
I can still, so I don't know why.
So thanks, thank you very much. Let me start with shortly discussing the scenarios that we are developing now for the third year in a row. We are looking at the trends that we are collecting and taking the 15 years between 2004 and 2018. We try to establish that what is going to happen if nothing really changes, if all the policies remain the same, all the movements in the various world regions stay how they were. Where would that lead us at the year of 2030? Corresponding to the target date of Agenda 2030 of the UN, which foresees, of course, a significant reduction of violent deaths by that time. We also try to look at positive and negative scenarios, each of those taking the best and the worst performing countries in their respective world regions and trying to project their annual growth or decrease of violent death rates in those countries to the other countries in their world region, thereby proposing a plausible negative and a positive scenario. Of course, nobody knows what the future holds. And as Niels Bohr famously said once, that predictions are very difficult, especially about the future. And this is probably even more so nowadays when we see a big disruption in the world with the COVID and related lockdowns and all the societal changes that would span certainly on various domains, including economics, but also including the safety and criminality and the conflicts in the world. We don't know what the future holds, but if we set this aside for a moment and we keep looking at these numbers, when we were finalizing this analysis before, we had known that there is a thing which is called COVID, so I still don't have control. Can you still move?
I did.
You did. Oh, perfect. So if we assume that there is still a business as usual in the world, then what we would find is that that by the year 2030, the violent death rate would further decrease a bit to 7.71. Now, as Anna just said, it is 7.8 by 100,000, and it is expected to end up at 7.71, which, if we compare it to 2015, the year when Agenda 2030 was adopted, represent a change, a decrease of 4%, which is not a significant reduction. And in the same time period, or from 2000 to 2030, the world's population is expected to grow by 12%. So the absolute numbers of violent deaths are expected to even exceed the bloodiest year of the recent past, which was 2014, with nearly 620,000 victims. By 2030, we are looking at more like 660,000 if the trend lines do not lie. This could be, of course, become significantly worse if things got worse, but it's probably more meaningful to look at the green line, which takes us to about 5 per 100,000 rate, and to about 430,000 deaths by 2030. And this happens when all the countries in each world region are able to replicate the best performers in terms of violent death reduction over the past 10 years. So based on past 10 years data, this is the best possible scenario that we can foresee if all countries could be as good as their fellow countries in their world region who were the best in reducing violent deaths or lethal violence in general. And what's interesting is that in the area between the dotted black line and the dotted green line, there is 1.43 million lives. So that means that based on compared to a business as usual scenario, this best case positive scenario could save nearly 1.5 million lives over the remaining 11 years until 2030. I can't move. Thank you. Right. As Gary mentioned, we are working with a lower bound estimate, which is partly because of the method, how we come up with our estimates, because we are adding up, counting up. We are looking at documented deaths as much as possible. We always prefer sources which are national and which are providing information on documented deaths, either based on administrative records in the criminal justice system, or maybe in the health care death registration systems, or by any other agents. But typically using sources which are kind of registries corresponding to the basic philosophy of GReVD, in the sense that they try to record documented deaths, and that clearly is not capturing everything. One famous example is the Darfur genocide, which was the first such event in the new century. And now, there were all kinds of estimates back then, mostly politically charged. Now, the consensus seems to be, in all UN documents, it says that the genocide had about 300,000 victims, which does not appear in documented deaths. So if we are looking at the documented portion of these deaths, which are provided by our GReVD partners, by ACLED or by UCDP, then the highest number we see is 20,000. And this is the number that we take as a small arms survey for our GVD, because we know that at least this many people have died. This is the highest of the well-documented death counts. But we also kind of know that this is a very low estimate of what could have happened. So that's one reason why our estimate is on the low end, and most probably is an underestimate of of the total violent deaths in any year. The other reason is that we, even in those settings where it's more peaceful and the states are functioning to some extent, and we are trying to collect data on criminal violence, that is intentional homicides, which should be a fairly simple phenomenon to define, to count, and to disseminate by any state. We still have significant data gaps, which we fill in by estimations, and I'd like to go to the next slide, but I can't. Right, so that's just one way to look at it. This chart shows each column is a year, and the height of the column is the number of the countries where we could obtain from either an international or a national public health or criminal justice source, either administrative counts or model-based estimates, a number of intentional homicides for that year. So even for the best year, which is 2010, it was not all countries that would have that data. And as closer we get to the reporting year, the less countries have their data published by then. But most of the countries do not publish on their own. Countries sometimes decide to send their data to UN systems, and homicide counts are accessible that way. But some are publishing on their own websites, and those are typically the ones that are included in the 2018 counts, because international systems do not produce those data in time for us to have included in the update. So that's not a lot of coverage. There's clearly a lot of gaps. And if we move to the next slide, then that shows that I took from UNODC's global homicide, global study of homicide methodology annex. This map shows the quality rating of the data that the UNODC is collecting from all nations, which classifies countries into 3 categories: good, fair, and low, in terms of internal consistency, external consistency, timeliness. So there are quality criteria. And the bottom line is that less than half of the countries reach a score of at least fair for the quality of the homicide data that they are providing, in the opinion of UNODC, who collects this data from them. And most countries either do not provide or provide a low quality data. And if you look at that class, which is the brown on the map, the darker brown, you can safely assume that the low quality probably means an undercount as well. So that you could, there is no way to test this hypothesis, but it's very plausible that low in this case means an insufficient count of the deaths. So we are shooting below the actual score. Can we move to the next one, please?
Yeah,
that's yours.
And this is back to me. It's just to conclude, because of course there is quite a lot of room for improvement. As you have seen, even Sweden is not in a position to provide the data that are of the best quality because of some technical reasons or because of many aspects. So what we have tried here to summarize as a conclusion is possible synergies, that would generate some advancement in knowledge by collaborating with the GReVD approach. So the first one is this database versus registry, that is the difference between a statistical approach and a personalized account of circumstances and details that would really add knowledge and would, as a result, probably generate additional numbers. The global versus local, that is the likelihood that a registry approach will work better at the local level, Of course, it would be crucial to fill some of the gaps that Gergely has just highlighted. The definitions issues that are very important. We know that, for example, for the conflict-related deaths component, different databases that work around different definitions, such as the CDP or the ACLED, that they may generate different numbers. And so working around these definitions would work as generating some flexibility and some shared understanding on different approaches. The quantitative versus qualitative, for sure, some qualitative research would be necessary now to complement the database approach. Also to understand, for example, at this Firearm survey, there has been a very good capacity building project on trying to increase the knowledge and use of indicators that would basically also convince the states that are not able to produce this data about their use and how good it could be to produce them in a way that is also shareable and usable. And obviously, the use of artificial intelligence and machine reading would increase enormously the availability of information. So it would be possible perhaps to access a basin of data that at the moment is not really captured at all. And definitely this in-depth analysis would produce better granularity, and we may gain also better knowledge of what we don't know. So that was my conclusion. So with this, I thank you very much, and we conclude our presentation. So I stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Anna. That was a great overview, and I think it's really helpful to get the perspective. And honestly, I want to reiterate, these are the best numbers. If you need a number and you're writing a policy report, and we have a variety of practitioners, academics, policymakers that are online here, use this number, 596,000 per year. And these statistics about the gender breakdown, 18%. These are the numbers that that we endorse, the GReVD Consortium endorses, and hopefully right now this helps you to be able to have some certainty about these numbers, and we all use the same numbers. What we're trying to avoid, and part of the reason we convene the consortium, is to reduce this kind of pick a number, any number, kind of perpetuating of these artificial numbers out there. And so I really want to stress that Small Arms Survey has done a lot of work on this methodology over many years. They have it all well documented. Anybody that replicates and did exactly the same steps they did would get the same numbers. And so I encourage you to use those numbers. We have a nice sized group on here. This is great. This is what we would love to have as a roundtable at the Stockholm Forum. So great to have so many people here. I can see a number of people are GReVD partners, but there's a number of people that are not familiar with GReVD necessarily. So I'm encouraging people, if you have questions on GVD or on the Small Arms Survey data or anything we've discussed so far, raise your hand on participants. I've got lots of questions that I can throw out there, but I'm gonna look to people. You can either raise your hand on participants or you can add a chat. So not seeing any immediate questions, but I do want to go back to this rate problem. So when you guys are doing that scenario, Anna and Gergely, can you guys discuss just a little bit, a couple of the assumptions, like the big level assumptions that are in that scenario, and which one we think is more realistic? We've been, a lot of people have been working on various scenarios and trying to think about 2030. And some of the discussion that we've had on scenarios is about applying prevention techniques that we've seen in other places in particularly fragile or conflict-affected places. So maybe speak a little bit to a couple of the assumptions or kind of what you think is possible there. And then maybe also speak a little bit, we also need to distinguish there, and I want to remind the people that are watching that a huge proportion, basically around 90% of those violent deaths are intentional homicides. So what we're seeing there is a lot of criminal violence. And then we also have our conflict violence that comes from our other GReVE consortium partners, ACLED, Uppsala, and the Global Terrorism Database. Global Terrorism Database is online with us here today too. So I don't see any other hands. So maybe just hand it back to you to expand a little bit more between the two of you on the assumptions and the probabilities of those scenarios.
Yeah, Gergely?
Yeah.
I think it's better if you start.
I don't think there is any living person on earth who could reliably discuss the validity of this scenario at this point, that if it makes any sense, looking to the future on the basis of what we knew about the past, because so many things are changing, and even without that change, we all know that model-based forecasts are just very shaky, especially which are so sensitive on discrete events. Like if there is a war erupting between two big nations, then it is going to completely disrupt any forecast on the deaths. But still, there is, as you say, that a lot of the violence are non-conflict, so happening in non-conflict settings, and those are a bit more structural than wars, because wars are structured in a different level, could be, but they are also very much dependent on politics and discrete events. But those structural levels of violence, probably it makes sense to model. So I don't. And what we are doing is specifically is that we break down basically intentional homicides are the basis of these predictions. And we look at the trends in intentional homicides in each of the world's 22 regions. These are like Southern Africa, Caribbeans, and places like that. And we look at those trends and we model them further based on simple trend fitting, and that is then aggregated to a global figure. And on top of that, we add the conflict separately, because we don't include conflict deaths in those regional deaths. We treat conflict as a global phenomenon. Conflict deaths for us are those deaths which are unlikely to be registered in any national criminal system, because they are not murders or not killings in that sense. So we are adding those deaths in places where really there is a conflict. Some of the data sets we are using are registering conflict deaths or deaths which are related to political struggle or political violence, which we assume that these are already registered in homicide. For example, Mexico is a typical example that in Mexico there's a lot of conflict deaths, but these are represented in the general homicide statistics, so we don't consider them among conflict deaths. But anyway, the point is that these war-related conflict deaths are then modeled separately, and we just put them along with a logarithmic trend on that, because they escalate so much, and it depends on the exact year. If we just let them grow as they want, if in 2015 it would have skyrocketed, and therefore we are just using a logarithmic trend which puts a slight upward curve currently on that trend, and we add that on top of homicides. So that, I don't think it's unrealistic, but also it's not a prediction. We are not calling them predictions. We are calling these lines as possible frameworks according to which we can think about what the future can bring, right?
Yeah, and I thought what was really powerful and useful about that is that wedge that develops over time when you compare the two scenarios, right? So here's something that's realistic. We think it's possible that either of these outcomes could happen. If this were to happen, you would save this many lives per year, but it's a very nice takeaway also that you said, look, this is what, 1.5 million lives that could be saved between now and 2030. Was that the right number, 1.5?
1.45, 43, 1.43 million, but yeah, almost.
Yeah.
Yeah. May I add something?
Yeah,
because you asked about assumptions, and actually there is still a big unknown in all this. There is a cause-effect relationship that is largely unexplored. So even the countries that manage to obtain a reduction, they still struggle to measure impact. So to know what they did well to obtain a reduction, if anything, or if it was just pure luck that they got a reduction. So the aspect of monitoring and evaluating policies, that is still lagging behind in the overall process of monitoring the Sustainable Development Goals.
Yeah, and I think part of that is related to the quality of data, which you both raised. I mean, and that's part of why we all collectively decided that the GReVE Consortium was a good way to push this forward, which is quality of data makes it so difficult to be able to monitor and evaluate programs like this, that a lot of what we're getting is anecdotal evidence that comes from a city intervention or a local violence prevention initiative. And what we would like to be able to do is systematize this. But you go back and look at the statistics that Gergely put up, and here's a tier 1 indicator from the SDGs about intentional homicides. It's been agreed upon globally, and then we only have less than half of the countries reporting these numbers annually, and the trend is going in the wrong direction on the quality of data. So that's something that we're all trying to work on, which is improve the quality of data so that we can monitor programs and interventions better, so that we can know where success is happening, where it's actually intentional. It's not just a random blip. And then we're able to report on that kind of evaluation with good quality data. So I think all of the GReVE partners are committed to that and producing high quality data. I still don't see any questions. Oh wait, here's a question from Russell. So everybody can see the chat.
Mm-hmm.
So here, right, we're talking about 2018 data. We know that the numbers are roughly like that. Homicides have a kind of trend. Conflict deaths are these kind of they're much more volatile variants. What do you think about where we're at, and how can we improve the lags on this moving forward? And I'll come back to that afterward, also with a little reflection on that GVD GReVE relationship. But Gergely, Anna, what do you think?
I can start, and Gergely may add more technical aspects. So the question from Russell, this is crucial. If you think that the official database for the SDG indicator, that is exactly the same as ours. So for target 16.1, you have 2 violent deaths indicators, one that is on homicides and one that is on conflict-related deaths. On conflict-related deaths, we are still at the methodological phase. There is a hope that by the end of 2020, there will be a global figure calculated by the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights that is in charge of developing this methodology. We will see. For the homicides official data on the SDGs, the last available year is 2017. So they lag 1 year behind us. So, and that is for the SDGs. To get anything more quickly, I mean, for me, it has been fascinating to monitor what was happening now during the COVID crisis, because my own country, Italy, was unable to calculate excess mortality because it takes such a long time that with all the pressure, all the situation that that was really crucial to understand what was happening, they were unable for a long time to measure excess mortality, you know, at the national level. So they had some spots from different you know, cities that were particularly good in providing the data. So I don't know, I think that there is, as I mentioned before, a need for a political will also to understand the importance of this data and to make them go up in the scale of the importance. Sometimes when you talk, especially, I don't know, you talk about law enforcement that is in charge of measuring data, monitoring data on violence, collecting data on violence. If you talk to the police, it is really the lowest of their priorities to collect statistics. And instead, if it would be possible to highlight the importance of collecting this data in a rapid way, more systematic and quickly, perhaps that could help.
Yeah, I think that's totally speculation, but there is a part of it which is not speculation. I see in various engagements that national statistical offices are very much struggling to simply operate. So if anything, we can expect that all non-essential statistics will be even further delayed, even on national level. And no matter what efforts we put in on an international level, those people on the you know, in the national offices who are now struggling with producing unemployment numbers and really essential economic statistics, which you cannot survive without, basically, and not speaking of health statistics that Anna is just mentioning. This is going to be very low on the priority list, right, so that's basically it. I think it is going to deteriorate further.
Don't come to us for happy news. I'm going to go to Caroline in just a minute, but I want to take this moment to actually go back to Anna and Gergely's last slide and the relationship between GVD and GReVD. I mean, it's a very positive relationship. We're very happy the Small Arms Survey is a member of the consortium and helping us to be able to move it forward. GVD has been doing this for many years through the global burden of armed violence and following out of the Geneva Declaration. It's got a long history of this, and they've got a methodology that's been built. They also have a network that connects to UNODC and UNOHCHR. Both are the owners, if you will, or the handlers of this data for SDG 16.1. And it's really important. Everybody that's online will understand and appreciate the value of us being able to do this work and think about how we would eventually have a registry. So this is down the line. What would the methodology look like where you would create an individual entry for every violent death by location and time, which is what we would need to actually get to account. And that's not something we can do next week. That's something that we need to do in years as we're developing that. But the relationship to keep that open, to be able to start having those conversations with national statistics offices and talk about capacity building, but then still have a good quality estimate coming out of GVD that tells us, here's a number that you ought to use, and also be able to keep the relationships open with UNODC and OHCHR. I mean, we really don't want them, and I don't know if anybody from those offices are online, but we've had conversations with them and they're very happy that we're doing this, I think, because they know what the limitations are of having member states reporting some of their own numbers. You saw what the quality of data numbers are. And, you know, ironically, the number that's the statistics out of Brazil were rated good. And now you look at the New York Times report this week on violent killings in Brazil, and it raises some serious flags. So it's good for us to be able to create the space for this conversation with the group around GReVD and be able to have those UN agencies still continue to push those forward. So it's not either or, it's and. You know, we're doing GVD, we've got to keep getting good quality numbers, and Caroline's going to explain why in just a minute with our lower bound, upper bound approach. We need to keep doing that, We need to keep building the methodology that'll standardize how we get numbers for homicides and conflict deaths and other violent deaths that aren't necessarily included in both of those, how we continue to build that methodology and standardize it globally, and then use those standards to be able to inform statistical capacity building and national statistics offices to do better in the future. So that's where, you know, some of the other folks that are online here with us, that's where we need your help. We need to be able to be connected to statistical capacity building processes that can be used for criminal and health services, and that can help us to be able to implement some of these new technologies to be able to answer these questions. I'm going to pass over to Caroline now. She's going to walk us through a nice visualization of that upper bound, lower bound approach. Caroline Delgado is a senior researcher with us at SIPRI and joins us on the GReVE team, in addition to her many other works on geography and mapping of violence, conflict, development, and humanitarian response. So Caroline, I'll hand it over to you now, and you can share your screen. Just a minute. It helps if I unmute you, I suppose.
Yes.
There you go. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Wondering how to tell you that you need to unmute me. Right, I'm going to try to share my screen and hopefully share the right one, but let me know if you're not seeing what you're meant to see. Let's see. So this is the one. Right. Gary, can you confirm that we're seeing the right screen?
Looks good. That's it.
Great. Okay, just going to reduce this window. Right, so this first graph, many, at least in the GReVE Consortium, would be familiar with. We had it in a number of briefs that we published, and it seeks to show the imprecision in violent death estimates, illustrating a range between the upper bound estimate and the lower bound estimate, and with the real number being somewhere in between. And it's this imprecision or range that the GReVE Consortium seeks to reduce. And it will do that by calculating 3 different estimates. So the first one is the lower bound estimate, and this map shows the GVD data. Point to say here is various years, so it's not the last year, and I'll get back to that shortly why there are different years here. And which GReVE uses as the lower bound estimate. And these are deaths, as we heard before, that are indisputably violent, including homicide, conflict deaths, and legal intervention killings. But also because GVD collates existing data, it's also subject to the limitations of the original data producer and is therefore a conservative estimate. And a point to make here as well, that all the estimates that we'll be seeing in this visualization are also rates per 100,000. So then we have a upper bound estimates, or 2 upper bound estimates, and they have a greater degree of uncertainty around whether they are truly violent deaths. So the first thing to say here, and which has been very clear from the working of the consortium so far, is that defining what constitutes a violent death is not as straightforward as it might sound. And the consortium is working on this and coming out with a shared definition and sort of setting out where the edges might fall. So to account for these definitional uncertainties, GReVE is calculating 2 upper bound estimates using a subtractive approach that Gary explained earlier, but in a sense meaning taking all deaths reported to the World Health Organization and subtracting those that are not violent, which is then quite opposite to the lower bound estimate that adds up all deaths that are deemed to be violent. So in this first visualization, we're showing the restrictive upper bound estimate, and it's calculated by subtracting all deaths that are indisputably not violent. So it shows the restrictive upper bound figures for those countries that last reported to the World Health Organization between 2006 and 2016. However, because of the definitional differences and because some of those responsible for recording the cause of death, such as medical personnel worldwide, may code the same cause of death differently, GReVE also produced an inclusive upper bound estimate. Right. For example, it's likely that many violent deaths that are coded as accidents, and to account for these uncertainties and to ensure that no violent death is missed, the inclusive upper bound estimate also accounts for, among other things, accidents. This will, of course, mean that there are some deaths included in the upper bound estimate that would probably not be considered violent. And these are the same countries that were in the previous map, but as you can see, the circles here are much bigger. So just going back to the previous one, you can see how those change. In this map, we have combined three estimates to clearly demonstrate the lack of precision in estimating violent deaths. So if you look at, just zoom into one symbol, you can see here that on the left-hand side, the smaller red circle is the lower bound, the GVD estimate. And on the right-hand side, the inner half circle is the restrictive estimate or the conservative estimate. And the outer half circle is the inclusive estimate, upper estimate. So there are many reasons for these differences, some that we discussed already, but in general, they're aligned to definition issues and the availability and quality of data. And I'll come back to this a little bit further on, zooming in. Here we see that not all countries report every year to the World Health Organization. So the map shows the most recent value year reported for the WHO for each country that actually reports to the WHO. So you can see that there's a quite big variation when it comes to when countries last reported. The latest available figures for WHO are from 2016, but some countries have actually not reported since the early 1980s. And these differences in when countries last reported also make cross-country comparisons of estimates quite difficult. Cross-country comparisons is also further complicated by countries reporting against different WHO coding systems, and these systems are not always compatible with each other. Most countries report against the current international classification of disease 10 or ICD-10 codes, which is shown in this map. Other countries will report against the ICD-10 mortality tabulation list 1, as this map shows. And the key difference here is that conflict-related deaths and legal intervention deaths are grouped together with deaths by accident. And since it's not possible to separate out these death, conflict and legal intervention deaths are not included in the restrictive upper bound estimate for these countries. And although it's not that many countries that report against this coding system, as you can see, it could still have a considerable impact on estimates for example, the Ukraine, Russian Federation, and Belarus. For example, in Ukraine, the UCDP registered 1,314 conflict-related deaths for the same WHO most recent value year, and for the Russian Federation, 86. Whereas Belarus, on the other hand, still maintains capital punishment. Sorry, just getting this to work. Right. Some countries report against ICD-9, which is totally incompatible with ICD-10, meaning that it's very difficult to ensure that the same categories are included in the different upper bound estimates. And then finally, quite a lot of countries do not even report mortality data to the WHO at all. So for these countries, GReVD is currently using the global health estimate data from WHO to calculate the restrictive and inclusive upper bound estimates. Another important limitation is China, which uses its own ICD-9 coding list. However, there's a lack of clarity around what kinds of death are counted under the different categories here. And because of that, GReVD is using global health estimate data also for China. And then as we saw in the last presentation, the quality of mortality data also varies markedly across countries. And that also affects comparison between countries. So this map shows the quality of death registration data as assessed by WHO. And I need to just point out here that unfortunately the legend needs to be updated with the right colors, but basically the lighter the yellow, the lower the quality of data. So the more darker colored countries have higher quality data. So bearing all these restrictions in mind, or limitations, if one were to compare or just look at European countries, looking only at those who reported against ICD-10 between the years 2006 and 16, one can see a clear difference between the three estimates, in particular between the lower bound and restrictive upper bounds estimates. So basically between the red dot and the first inner circle. However, if one looks at Central America and part of Latin America, the lower bound and restrictive upper bound estimates are actually quite equal in many countries. Moreover, the difference between the restrictive and inclusive upper bound estimates is also much smaller than in Europe. So if we go back just to look at Europe again, we can note this quite clear difference. This ought to perhaps suggest better precision, but it's also important to note that the quality of data in some of the countries in this region is relatively low. Then in a few notable cases, such as Honduras, you'll see that the lower bound estimate is in fact much bigger than the two upper bound estimates. And this is also the case for example, South Africa and Iraq. So that brings me back to, or brings to the end of the visualization, and I want to go back to this first graph. And we want to emphasize that in the spirit of the Sustainable Development Goals of leaving no one behind, the GReVD Consortium contends that every violent death should be registered and counted. And to this end, the Consortium will provide a yearly lower and upper bound estimates to increase precision, while retrospectively adjust previous year's estimate as technology and coding improves. So finally, what are the estimates for 2020? So the first lower and upper estimates produced by the GReVD Consortium for year 2020 show a global lower bound estimate of 596,000 violent deaths, which is of course the Small Arms Service GVD figure, and a restrictive upper bound estimate of 1,370,000 violent deaths. However, it's important to point out here that the WHO has not yet published its mortality data for 2018, not in 2017. So the upper bound estimate presented here is a very preliminary one. We are, however, in the process of producing a brief detailing in much more thoroughly the upper and lower bound estimates, and also setting out how we got to these 2020 estimates. And that will be available shortly on the GReVD website. And with that, I'll end this presentation, and thank you very much for listening.
Thanks so much, Caroline. That was great. I'm going to open it in a minute to questions. We had a question from Rex that I will try to get to a little bit here. I just want to highlight there, you're all getting a sneak peek at some work we've been doing with that 1.37 million number. As Caroline very clearly described there, you basically have about 7 or 8 different coding regimes in the world. And these different countries use these different regimes to report these numbers out of health statistics, health administrative reporting. And as a result, there is a different methodology for each of those types of regimes, including a unique methodology for China that gets you a number that says, look, if you take all deaths and you take out everything that couldn't possibly be violent, here's how we get to a number. And so we need to write up and document exactly those 8 different types of approaches. But that's the only way to get to those numbers that are the circles on the right-hand side that show you the upper bound. And it's the only way to get to a number, that 1.37 million. So our job is to be able to document that, show people this is our best guess, and then be able to say to people, look, if you'd like to improve on this, come and work with us, come and work with the consortium, because we're trying to solve this problem. But it is troubling that, you know, we have this really conservative number. And by the way, this was all the product of a workshop that we did last year in Geneva, hosted by Small Arms Survey and the GReVD Consortium, and supported by UK Aid. Thank you very much. And that brought us all together to be able to have that conversation, because for a variety of reasons, and the kind of hand-wringing and head-shaking that you see us all doing as we're describing this data, none of us is comfortable telling you a point estimate. We're comfortable telling you the best estimate we have, that's a conservative number that comes out of GVD, and we're comfortable telling you, here's how you would get to a number that looks like an upper bound estimate. And by the way, if you take those, that other circle, the bigger one that Caroline showed, and you estimate, but globally, you get to around 6 million. So that's a lot of uncertainty that's showing up in that range. So we wanted to show you two numbers that we have a little bit of confidence in. But for the reasons that I think we've pointed out here, there's a number of reasons why we should be very careful with these numbers as we're using them and reporting them. Hopefully we've made them a little bit more clear to you in the course of this conversation. We'll go back quickly to Rex's question before we open it up to question and answer. And I don't see any hands raised yet, but if you have a question, raise your hand on participants or add a question in the chat. The question that Rex had asked was about data quality. We haven't yet made an index that says, here's this level of data. And part of the reason is because we're a little concerned about the methodologies for identifying data quality that come out of both WHO and UNODC. So we did do some preliminary statistics that says, look, what if we take the number between the lower bound and the upper bound, the number between GVD and what we get out of this methodology that Caroline just described, and we do that for every country. And then we look to see if there's a relationship between the range there and any of this coding of data quality that comes out of UNODC or WHO, or even the World Bank's statistical capacity. And so I spent about a week going through every combination of every one of those things to look for relationships. You can insert some dummy variables and get a little bit of explanatory power, but there is a lot of fuzziness in even those rankings by those three different organizations. First of all, there's no correlation necessarily between WHO quality data and UNODC quality data, and maybe that's an interesting research area. I mean, maybe you can have health systems that work, but criminal justice systems that don't want to report particular numbers. Maybe you have high quality statistical capacity in the country, but you don't want to report either of these numbers through health or criminal justice. So maybe there's something there about political will, but right now it's really tough to be able to find any kind of statistical relationship between those three assessments of statistical quality and the gap, the range between the lower bound and upper bound that Caroline has pointed out here. So Rex, we're still grappling with that. It's a good question. We have all three of those numbers, and we're happy to share those numbers with anybody that wants to do some nice analysis on it. But we're trying to also figure out what, maybe it's just different types of problems, right? So maybe there's some countries that don't report well on criminal. You can get more information from health, and then you need to reconcile that with overall statistical capacity building, which maybe tells you from the World Bank. Maybe there's other countries that are not good at any of them. Maybe there's some countries that should be better based on their statistical capacity. So then it's a political will question. Those are open research questions. Gergely, yeah. Yeah, I got it. I get it.
You silenced me, but yeah, I was cutting out. I'm not sure if suicides are included in the restricted lower bound. Are they or are they not?
I'll pass to Caroline, but I think I know the answer.
I think I know the answer too, but that would explain a lot of the difference, because if they are included, then they are about as many as violent deaths, nearly as much.
Yeah, and, it's about 700,000 a year.
About how many?
I believe it's about 700,000 a year globally.
Oh, okay. Then it's all right. So it's the same order of magnitude. So if we just add those to the GVD other violent deaths, then we would end up more or less with the lower with the restricted upper bound, right?
but I believe we left him out of the restrictive number.
Oh,
Caroline,
okay, so that's a question then.
Okay, yes, so am I muted?
No, we can hear you.
So it's actually a discussion that we've had, and at the moment they are, as you said, they are included in the restricted upper bound, and we sort of did think about that might be explaining, for example, the difference that we saw in Europe. But we want to go back and think about that more carefully within the consortium. Do we really want to include them in the restricted upper bound or not? Because it goes back to our discussions on definitions, where we draw the edges, etc. So maybe also a thing to point out here is that this is sort of like the first attempt of looking at the different ways of estimating that we could do, and the way that we selected what kind of causes of deaths would be included is sort of a little bit done as we go along, but it's not always sort of the final agreed decision, so we need to go back to that. But also, it is not clear from the different coding systems if you can separate out self-intentional harm. And it's also listed very differently. In some coding system, it will say suicide. In other, it would say intentional self-harm. And in the third one, it would be something even a little bit more blurry. So it's not always sure, depending on what ICD coding system countries report to, what's actually included. So it's that also go back. So it's very hard to compare between countries because of all these differences, both in time and in quality and in what kind of coding system that countries report to.
And it should also note that the SDG 16.1.1 is intentional homicides. This is where UNODC's focus is, and they have to focus on that because that is the standard that has been agreed upon by member states, and that's the target and the indicator that has been agreed upon. However, if you are the victim of manslaughter or unintentional homicide, that clearly would be considered a violent death by you or by your family. And so what we want to do is create a space where we can be able to code violent deaths, all of the things that would be included as violent deaths, and be able to create common standards and global standards, and then be able to have the space where intentionality can be a column. It can be a filter so that UNODC can eventually be able to have data that reconciles with data that's in the registry, right? So we need to be cognizant of all of the obligations and commitments that agencies have in monitoring these things, but we also are trying to solve this problem generally. And part of the reason we're trying to solve that, I'll get to in just a second, Anna, part of the reason we're trying to solve that is there are some people that will start calling things and reporting things as suicides or as unintentional deaths if we build a system that only captures some of those things, right? So we want to create a mechanism that allows anything that looks like a violent death to be coded, and then be able to figure out what are the criteria by which you can filter or be able to use for reporting. Yes, Anna, please, I need to unmute you. Here you are.
No. Okay, thank you. No, I wanted just to say that, of course, here we are really reaching the limit because the public health system, okay, is capable of looking at the dead body and establishing that that's a dead body. Then it's already the violence component is something that, okay, may be established from a medical point of view, but then when you start getting closer to the self-harm and the intentionality, then you really need a sort of criminal justice component that basically matches the ability of the criminal justice system to produce the same information. So if you don't have this criminal justice ability in a country, you don't have it. So the public health information doesn't add anything to numbers that are missing. There is another thing that is important instead, and it is that public health is much more familiar with statistical methods and estimates than criminal justice. For criminal justice, one is one, so this is normally administrative statistics that refer to crimes, that refer to events that are well identified, and the extrapolation and the estimation is a completely alien concept. So with playing a bit with the two systems, I think it makes sense to try to build on the strengths of different countries in one or the other and try to balance the differences.
Yeah, and these are not easy problems to solve, by the way. None of us are suggesting this is easy, but we are suggesting that if, development actors and the international community and multilateral agencies are serious about statistical capacity building and about eventually having good numbers, these are the steps they're going to have to take. So what we're trying to map out is the ways in which this would be done. I want to quickly share a screen with you that is exactly that, what we're mapping out. I hope you can see it. This is the challenges framework that we have on the GReVD website. And here what we've done is we've started laying out things that need to be done and things that will need eventually to be done in the medium term and the long term. But showing, here are some steps that need to be taken. Some of the things we've done already, and we've already been adjusting this to kind of respond to COVID. Here's a proposal that was put together on AI applications from our friends at Klein. And here is what we're thinking about information management systems. You can scroll to the right here. But this is a challenges framework that we're building that shows you this is what we're all working on. And these are the steps that are going to need to be taken. We're gonna keep updating this challenges framework as we keep moving forward. So for those of you just learning about GReVD or just joining us, you can come here and be able to see what we're working on right now, what we're thinking about, and where we think that the conversation needs to go. Let's see. There was a question here from Jago about DESA. And yes, that's part of the reason we've had this conversation with ODC and OHCHR, but also we looks like we're going to have a session on data at the UN Data Forum in October. So we're excited about that. We're joining with some new friends from Geocensos in Colombia, and Small Arms Survey will be there, of course, and a couple other of our partners, including ACLED. So that conversation is an ongoing conversation. How do we help to be able to solve some of these problems behind the scenes, knowing full well that our UN friends have to navigate the political dimensions of measurement for a lot of these things. David, do you want to jump on and you can just ask your question? We can have a little conversation. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to go back to David. David, I've unmuted you.
Okay, thanks, Gary. Were you pointing to my comment on the chat?
Yeah, I thought maybe you just
I was
wanted.
just wanting to follow up on what Anna pointed out, that while it's true that there are epidemiologists that deal with estimates, at least my take would be that the public health people that deal with things like vital statistics are not in the business of making estimates, that they're in the same boat as those in the criminal justice system that record homicides and the like, and the equivalent to the epidemiologists would be people that do research on criminal justice that may do estimates, or the people that do things like trying to track from media-based reports the number of police killings or the like, that are doing things in a research context where they don't have individual death reports to coroners. They may just have reports. So I'm not sure that the fields, the delineation that you were drawing across these fields is necessarily a hard and sharp delineation in practice. It may just be a delineation between those that are involved in a vital statistics enterprises versus those that are involved in a research enterprise where they don't have the same sort of mandate and the same sort of foundations in terms of what they base their accounting on.
I think Anna replied a little bit there. You want to reply, Anna?
Can I speak? Yeah. Yes, of course, of course. I mean, this is an excellent point. Clearly, it's not that you have a system of registration, but what happens is that in the public health system, they don't jump if they see an estimate that is based on data registered. In the criminal justice sector, instead, it is a very recent development that these numbers are shared, first of all, because it was still considered to be something very secret, that crime and criminal justice statistics are shared publicly. And there was a total lack of understanding of their policy use. You know? Instead, in public health, it's a long time that you have, for example, surveys carried out, because you really need to find phenomena. So there are even mortality surveys that are carried out. So there are estimates of mortality that are carried out. So it is a completely different familiarity with the statistics. That now, instead, also the criminal justice system understands the importance of knowing more about what happens and adding policy relevance to data that were perceived to be exclusively administrative in the past.
Thanks. I don't see any more hands raised. I'm going to take the moment where I think we've covered pretty much everything. There may be another question or something. I'll leave it open for a second. I'm going to point out a couple of things. One is the Earth Time present, the visualization that Caroline shared is done on Earth Time. They're one of our partners in the GReVD Consortium at the Carnegie Mellon Create Lab. The description of them is on the GReVD website. But what we're looking forward to with them is continuing to build out good visualizations that show all of this data that allow us to zoom in and talk more deeply about the data that we have and where we'd like to improve that. And so we'll actually add a link to that Earth Time visualization to the GReVD website in the next couple of days as we update it. And you'll be able to go in there and explore the story yourself. And it's nice to be able to get in there and be able to click on the time and let it run and be able to see visualization there. That's one thing. Another thing I wanted to make sure we covered is that tomorrow at the same time for the Stockholm Forum, we're going to have another session. That one's going to be about coding, and it's going to go from soup to nuts, all the way from the original observation of a violent death happening to what process, all the different steps that it needs to go through before it actually becomes an entry in a thing like a registry. And that uses a framework that we developed with the entire GReVD Consortium. It's available online. It's called the 5x9 framework. That came from a lot of work that Klein School did with us. They're one of the consortium partners, and they're online here. Hi, Scott and Dan. And so we're going to have that discussion tomorrow. And the cool thing that we've got coming in with that too is that ACLED has arranged some of their coding partners to join that conversation. So they're going to join us at the very beginning, just saying, look, this is what it looks like when you're in an observatory on the front lines in DRC or the Sahel and reporting on violence. And this is what it looks like before it becomes that number that you eventually have in the registry. Which raises the point that Anna and I have stressed so many times, which is the value of the registry is not just numbers, it's not just counts, but it's also providing a way for people to be able to get acknowledgement and maybe even some kind of record and some kind of reconciliation, or at least truth, that's associated with having statistics that are high quality, that record and reflect the fact that somebody has died through violence. So what we're trying to do with the registry is not just create another count, but also to create a way in which this can register violent deaths over time. That's another distinction. All of our partners contribute a number of different things, but we hope that collectively we can build something that reflects that in the registry. My last thing, I'm going to go back to Anna and Gergely and Caroline for any last comments or reflections, because I don't see any questions, which just suggests to me that we've answered every question there is about violent deaths. My last thing is to remind people that there's this really cool auction that's going on for humanium medals associated with the Stockholm Forum. You can click through it on the chat, and please share that with your networks. You could just even tweet it or show it to other people. Humanium metals takes weapons that have been small arms, and they melt them down and they turn them into other things. And they're auctioning 3 items off in association with the Stockholm Forum. And all of the money just goes on to help Humanium metals continue to do the good work they do in countries to be able to take small arms out of circulation. So I will stop there. Give the first prerogative to Anna. Do you have anything else you want to add in, or any last reflections?
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much. Thank you for hosting this, and thank you for this discussion that actually you said it well. Since last year when we started the discussion on GReVD, we didn't have the possibility to talk about the boundaries in a more elaborated way and looking actually at figures. So now it looks that we are really very, very close, because basically what we calculate in GVD without the suicide component and the upper bound that includes instead, that is very close to what was happening some years ago when the global violent death database was compared to the WHO estimates when they were published still through the WHO work on violence. So I think that this is very reassuring to see that we are getting close to something that existed already in the past in terms of methodologies and calculations. And it's likely also to reassure everybody that we are not inventing anything strange. I liked very much what Caroline said about the connection of the registry with leaving nobody behind. Indeed, the registry approach has an enormous value. I remember meeting this type of approach in Nepal when I was working close with an NGO that wanted to improve their methodology to collect information on violent deaths. And they were really explaining to me the importance to have this information also for recognition of the victims and making sure that these things don't happen anymore. So thank you for hosting this.
Thanks, Anna. And Gergely, will go just to you, and then Caroline, any last reflections, and then I'll conclude us.
Yeah, I was. Thank you for the opportunity, and I think it was a great discussion. I hope we continue in the future with these things. I'm shocked actually that all the difference between the current upper bound and lower bound estimate is suicides only, and I think it deserves a closer look. It's unlikely that it should be like that, but it's really exciting. So I'm very happy. I loved the charts. I love this Earth time, whatever the platform it is. So I'm really looking forward to continue with this. As to yeah, I just pass on Caroline. I think Anna said everything, and I also think that it's we are also fulfilling some kind of moral obligation that we don't let these deaths slip out of mankind's memory, and we try to make our best to document them as best as possible.
Caroline?
Thank you. Well, thank you, everybody. And maybe just to pick up on what Gary mentioned just now, that we're using Earth Time and creating many different stories, as they're called, on the platform, to illustrate some of the challenges that are aligned to measuring violent deaths. And there's one story that we will publish shortly, and I'll just flag that one, and it looks at the challenges and difficulties on integrating different data sets. So we have a number of data producers, part of the GReVD Consortium, including ACLED, GTD, the Global Terrorism Database, and Uppsala Conflict Database Project. And we did one visualization that looks at, if we want to look at deaths that are recorded between GTD and Uppsala, just looking at 1 year in one country, which is Colombia in this case, what duplication challenges emerges when you actually look at them geographically, you know, where they're located, what might be the same death, what might not be the same death, and how do you decide, is this actually a unique event or not? So just flagging that, and I'm sure, you know, a lot of that will come up in the discussions tomorrow, but keep a lookout on the GReVD website, and that story will be there shortly as well. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Yeah, I think that was a great overview. I'm not going to add anything else to it other than to thank the Postcode Foundation, which got us here. We've done a lot of work in the last year, and I think a lot of that is reflected here. We're going to have 2 more conversations, one tomorrow, and we're putting together another one for next week that's going to be about visualizations and how you can use this GIS data for good policymaking. So we've got some exciting things coming on that too. So we'll post that on the forum website as soon as we've got the date and time. Very happy to have everybody else in this conversation. The Postcode Foundation link is there in the chat window. We'll follow up with any little requests that were in the comments and look forward to continuing the conversation. Hope you'll join us tomorrow. Thanks, everybody.